Good morning. On Monday we talked about a very simple approach to modeling dynamic biological systems using recursion relations, which was where we had a situation where we had a model where the things were changing in discrete steps. Today we're going to talk about extending that to systems that are more complicated than that. And so we're going to talk, the readings are shown here, which you should have already had. So what we're going to start with is the type of recursion relations that we had, that we talked about on Monday, were a case where we had a discrete change in our, what we would call our independent variable, the generation number, and then we had some formula, a relation that described how the number of insects changed from generation to generation in those discrete steps. Okay? And so we can always express, if we're given a recursion relation, we can always express it as a difference equation, by which we mean an equation that tells us how much of a change there will be from one generation to another. So whenever we're given something like this, so here's our recursion relation, number of the insects in the next generation is some function of the previous one. We can always rewrite that, regardless of what f is, we can always rewrite that as the change in x at generation I is the function minus the number in the previous generation. Okay? So whether we're talking about insects or anything else, if we have a recursion relation where we have this discrete change, we can always rewrite that as a difference equation. Now, what we're going to talk about today is what happens if that assumption is not the case, that is, the process where we don't happen in discrete steps, but in continuous steps, and then we need to use differential equations. And I'm sure you all remember this from your calculus class, right? A differential equation is measuring the rate of change as a function of an infinitesimally small change in our independent variable. Okay? So, what do we do in that case? So, what we have when we have a difference equation is we're able to directly calculate exactly at every generation, given the number in the previous, the exact number of insects in that case, or the exact value of the dependent variable as a function of the value of the independent variable. So no matter how far out we want to go, we can always just integrate from the initial value, just keep adding and keep applying the recursion relation until we get to any particular value we want. We can do that perfectly accurately to whatever the numerical accuracy is. Now, those difference equations imply that there's kind of a lockstep between the independent variable, in our case the generation number, and the dependent variable, the number of insects, so that they're both changing in discrete steps, and they're both changing together. Okay? But when we have differential equations, that kind of notion is lost. So there's not that kind of synchronicity between the changes, that they can only both change together, but the variables are changing continuously and are sort of all changing together. All right, and so now what we can introduce then is, analogously to the way we introduced the recursion relation, we can talk about the way in which we can express the general concept of a differential equation. So that would be that we talk about the amount of change, the rate of change of our dependent variable that we're going to call I, and we're going to potentially have more than one of them. So we're going to have y sub I, which is a function of x. So the rate of change of that y sub I as a function of a small change in the independent variable x is going to be given to us by some function that is going to be a function of x and potentially all the other y's. Okay, so this function is going to be a different function for each I variable, and we're going to think of it as f prime, right? It's the function that describes the differential of variable I. Okay, and that's going to be for some number of y variables. All right, so that's very straightforward. The general form, as we call it, where we say that for each of our dependent variables, we're going to have a differential equation of this form, just the differential of that variable as a function of x is going to be given by some function. Okay? Now, some differential equations can be solved analytically, by which we mean that we can convert that differential equation into a direct expression, an analytical expression for the dependent variables. So we can get a function of the form that y sub I of x equals some expression. But that actually turns out to be the minority of cases for the kinds of systems that we're interested in. So most of the ones that we're dealing with will not have an analytical solution. And the alternative to that is to use numerical integration, as it's called. Right? Analytical integration, you remember from, is the form that you learned in calculus. But the alternative is to do numerical integration. And some of you may have had that if you've taken any calculus past the normal two semester sequence. All right, so the idea of the numerical integration is that what we're going to say is in order to be able to estimate the value of the variables as a function of the independent variable, we're going to replace the real definition of the differential, namely that it's the change in a small, infinitesimally small amount of x. We're going to just say, well, let's just choose a change in x that's pretty small. And we're going to see what we mean by that in a minute. But we're going to just convert that differential equation into a difference equation by replacing that dx with a very small delta x. Okay? And that's called the integration interval, or the step size, that the amount by which we're going to change x, this small value, is our integration interval, or our step size. And once we've done that, then we've just turned our differential equation into a difference equation. And intuitively, it makes sense that the smaller we make this step size, then the more accurate that our approximation is going to be. Right? In the limit, as we decrease that to 0, we approach asymptotically perfect accuracy. But obviously, when we're doing this computationally, think of it as this for loop that we're running over, where we've now got our small change in x, and we're going to now have to go over a lot of different values in order to get from our starting condition to a particular value of x. That's going to be a lot of iterations. There's going to be a lot of computing if we use a very, very small value. So that's going to introduce some kind of trade-off between the size of that step and the number of steps that we have to take and the accuracy of the result that we get. All right, so we'll talk more about that in a minute. So the simplest way in which we do numerical integration, many of you may have seen this before, is what's called Euler's method. As we said, we just simply take the differential and convert it to a difference, so that where we used to have dy of I dx, we have delta y of I for delta x, with the exact same right-hand side, the exact same function. All right? And then we just calculate the actual delta y by multiplying this function times the delta x. Right? So this gives us something that is exactly the same as what we looked at last time, which is that in order to calculate the new y, the change in y, we just multiply the amount of change we're allowing in x times the value of the function, where, and this is very important, the function is evaluated at the current value of x and all of the dependent variables. Okay, so that allows us to, once we have a difference equation, we can convert that to a recursion relation, where we just say that the value of y sub I at some point at j plus 1, the next point, will be the value of y sub I at the jth point plus this approximation where we take the small value of x and multiplying it times the differential equation. Note, again, evaluated at the current values of x. Okay? And then we just update the value of x by adding this delta x. So this gives us, just if you think about this, the spreadsheet we had on the first day, this is our x is just incrementing, and then we're just incrementing our y value, and we can have more than one y value that is incrementing. And in each case, they're being evaluated, this function, whatever it is being evaluated at the current values of x and all of the y's. Now, that raises a very important point. There's asymmetry in these equations. We're trying to calculate the value of y at the next point, but we're using the value of the derivative at the current point. Okay? So notice that asymmetry, right? That we're at current values of x and y, and we're trying to project what's the next value of y going to be, but we're using only the derivative at the current point. Right? And if the derivative is changing, so as we're going from where we are to the next point where this separation is delta x, if the derivative is changing, then we're going to be making a mistake. We're not going to be estimating accurately the amount by which that variable is changing. So we're going to illustrate that by a couple of examples here. Okay? So here's the idea. We're going to consider the differential equation dy dx is 6x plus 2. So this 6x plus 2 is f prime of 1, where we only have one variable, one y variable here. So that's your f prime, 6x plus 2. And the solution, the analytical solution, there one exists for this equation, is 3x squared plus 2x, right? Plus some integration constant. Now, what we're plotting here is, as a function of x, I'm plotting the solution in purple here, in cyan, the analytical solution, which we know. This is the right answer. Regardless of where we are in x, this is the right answer, and that's what this should be right here. Okay? Now, what I'm also plotting, that's on this scale, y is on this scale. On the x scale over here, I'm plotting the value of the derivative, and the value of the derivative is this, 6x plus 2. Right? So, as x increases, the derivative is increasing. That's what's in the green triangles. Right? And that's on this scale over here. Now, if we use the method we talked about on the previous slide, the Euler's method, the way in which we're going to use that is we're going to take the current value, so x is 0 and y is 0, and we're here, and then we're going to calculate what value we think that y will have at the next point. How are we going to do that? We're going to evaluate 6x plus 2 at x equals 0. So that's going to give us a value of 2. And then we're going to add that to the current value of y, which is 0. So we're going to get a value of 2. Okay? And that's what this blue curve is showing. That's the Euler integration of this equation with a step size of 1. Okay? Now, what you'll notice is that this blue line is below the cyan line. Right? That is, the magenta line. That is we're underestimating the rate of change of y. Why is that the case? Because the derivative is increasing, as we see in the green triangles. Okay? So when the derivative is increasing, we're going to be underestimating the amount of change because it's changing faster as we move to the right, and we're just thinking that it's changing at the same rate as it was here. Okay? So, conceptually, what we would like to be able to do is to estimate a value for this point using the derivative at this point somehow. Okay? And one way that we could do that is to use what's called the midpoint method. What we're going to say is, we're going to take the value of the derivative on the left side, and we're going to take the value of the derivative on the right side, and we're going to average them together, and that's going to be sort of the value in the middle of that integration interval. and then we use that value. Okay? Now, we know the value of x at the next interval, but we don't always know the values of y's, right? We're trying to integrate y. And so, of course, when we have an analytical solution, we do have it. So what we do in the midpoint integration method is that we estimate what y would be at the next value of x, and then we average that estimated value in with the value on the other side, and we try to estimate the value at the midpoint. Okay? So that's called the midpoint method. It's also called the second order Runge-Kutta method, as we'll see in a minute. So the idea is that here's our Euler's method. The amount of change in y is the delta x times the function. And the midpoint method is going to first try to make an estimate of the derivative by adding delta x over 2, the halfway point, delta x over 2 to the x, and we add this amount of change of y and cut it in half, so that's the midpoint. So this is the x midpoint, this is the y midpoint, and then evaluate the rate of change there, and then we use this to actually estimate the next point. Right? So we calculate the delta y using the function evaluated at the x and the y midpoints, and then use that estimate and add it to the previous value to give us the next value. Okay? And so let's see what happens if we try that. So here's again our analytical solution, and the derivative in green, and then in the open squares there, that is the estimated derivative at the midpoint. So we estimate the derivative, the change to go to here, take it in half, jump back, and estimate the value of the derivative, and that's what this is here. Okay? So it's an interpolation along this line. If we use that value, then the analytical solution in magenta and the midpoint method, the second order Runge-Kutta method, gives us the same value. The blue and the magenta are superimposed here. So that gives us perfect performance. So now we have a numerical system, a numerical integration, and it's giving us the exactly correct answer. Now that sounds like magic, and it is because the reason that works is because the derivative is not a function of y. So we can make a very good estimate of what the derivative is going to be at the midpoint here, because it's a function only of x. And we know what x is going to be at the midpoint. We don't know what y is going to be at the midpoint. So let's consider another system. In this case, we're going to have dy dx equals 3y. And the solution is this exponential, y equals e to the 3x. All right. So in this case, where here's again x, here's our analytical solution. Right? Here was our midpoint. This is the Euler method right here. This one right there. And here is using that midpoint method where we try to estimate the value of the derivative at the midpoint of the interval. And it's better. Notice, it went from here up to here, but it still didn't make it to here. All right? So this is an improvement because we made an estimate of the value of y to plug into this differential. Where we're going to evaluate y, we're going to try to evaluate the differential here, but that value is an underestimate because the differential is now increasing non-linearly. Okay? So part of the idea here is that you should be able to see that as we get a better estimate of the derivative, of the values at which we should evaluate their derivative, we can get closer and closer to the actual value. Okay? Now, there are a whole family of approaches where we don't just estimate the derivative in the middle, we estimate it part of the way, and then in the middle, and then another part of the way, and continuously do that. And I don't need you to remember all of these different values. That they're called, as I mentioned, this Runge-Kutta method. They're different. That's a family of methods where we add more and more terms. One of the most commonly used one is the fourth order Runge-Kutta, where we make an estimate in the middle, and then we make another two estimates, and then we average all those estimates together. Again, don't worry about the math, but the idea is that what we want to have is a way where we can refine our estimate of the derivative. Okay. Now, another important point here. I mentioned a trade-off between the size of the integration interval, the change in x, and the ultimate accuracy of our integration, which we saw for the example where we had when we were using a big value of x, we're getting a poor approximation to the real value. If we had decreased x, even with the Euler's method, if we kept decreasing delta x, we would have gotten closer and closer to that value, to that analytical solution, or the correct answer. So we have a trade-off then using a smaller value of x, but that takes more calculations. Now the Runge-Kutta methods let us kind of reverse part of that trade-off by saying, well, we'll still use a medium-sized or smaller-sized x, but not very, very small, delta x, but we'll do a little bit more calculation for each interval, and it will come out more accurately. Okay? All right, so at this point, just to summarize, what we've gone through is we understand that for many systems, they're going to have continuous changes in x and y, and that can be captured by a differential equation that tells us the rate of change of y as a function of x. And then we can convert those differential equations into difference equations so that we can integrate them numerically. And when we do that, one of the considerations is going to be how small should the step size be, and what integration method should we use, whether the simplest version or one of these more complicated versions that take more computing but give us more accurate estimates. Okay? Now, let's start to consider some cases where we build models that use differential equations. And what our goal is going to be, as it was before, where we had our parameter line where we summarized the behavior of the system as a function of different values of the parameter. In this case, and of course it also depended on what the initial value of the number of insects was. So we're going to, as before, we're going to call the things that are the constants, the things that are in the differential equation that are not the variables themselves, these parameters. We're going to be interested in how does the system change as a function of those parameters, and we're going to be interested in how does it change as a function of what we're going to call the boundary conditions. Just think of that as sort of where we start. It's the start to our integration. Another way of looking at it is initial concentration, but the more general term is boundary conditions. Okay, so boundary conditions and the kind of problems we get are two kinds of problems. If we have the values of x and all of the dependent variables at some initial time, at some fixed time, then that's called an initial value problem. That's by far the most common cases, and that's the cases we're going to deal with exclusively. But it's just so you know, there are also cases where you might know x and y1 at one value of x, and you know y2 at some other value of x, but you don't know the other ones. And those are called two-point problems. And they're more difficult to solve. We're not going to deal with them, but just so you know that there are two different ways in which you can specify what you know about the system. Okay, so we're going to deal with initial value problems, and that's going to give us the value of all of the things that we're interested in as at a particular point in time. So now we're going to consider an actual system, just like we did for the insects before. We're going to consider another classic system. And this is a system in which we have two species, and the species interact with each other. Okay? The most common way of thinking of this is that we have one species that is a predator for the other species. Okay? So we're going to have some concept there that to model the behavior of that system, we have to somehow capture the interaction between the species, right? The effect that one has upon the other, such as the rate at which they prey upon, or one preys upon the other. So a very simple set of equations, but very powerful set of equations that describes a system of this type is called the Lotke-Voltera equations. And they're shown here. In this case, we're going to just have two variables in addition to time. So the time is going to be our independent variable, and then x and y are going to become our dependent variables. Rather than saying y1 and y2, we're going to just say x and y. So we have t, x, and y, where x is one of the species, y is the other species, and then we have our differential equations, right? So this part right here is the differential equation is the function that f prime that describes the rate of change of the prey. Okay? Now, let's take that apart. What we can see is that we have some constant r, which tells us the rate of change of the prey is just like we had before, where there was some rate constant that tells how fast it's growing, its growth rate. Right? So that's going to be a function of the current number. Now notice we don't have sub-i's on any of this, right? We don't have generations. It's just a variable that's continuous. X is continuously changing, and whatever the current value of x is, the rate of change is going to be r times the current value of x. So that's the growth of the prey organisms, but that's going to be compensated for. We're going to subtract from that the rate at which they are killed by the predators, and that rate, given by constant a, is going to be multiplied times the number of predators and the number of prey. So in other words, the more prey we have and the more predators we have, the more interactions between them and the more prey that are killed. Right? And the rate at which the constant that tells us exactly how much are being killed is this constant a. Think of that as the probability that a prey will die if it encounters a predator. Now, for the predators, on the other hand, we have instead of worrying about their growth, we're going to assume that the most important thing is that for them, they're going to die at some rate that's going to be this minus m. So the m is going to be the rate at which they just spontaneously die, but their rate at which they increase is going to be proportional to how many of the prey they eat. Okay, so again, for every time they interact, there's some probability b that's going to enhance their ability to grow. So the rate at which they're growing is proportional to the interactions between the predator and the prey with that constant b, and then the rate at which they die off is this rate n. Okay, and that's the negative, meaning it's a growth rate where we're actually converting it into a death rate. All right, so what we can do is we can, just like we did before, we can get values for our parameters, a, b, m, and r. All right, so in this case, we just set them all equal to 1. And we can integrate, as described on page 130 of the reading, where we just take their equations and do numerical integration as we've discussed, where we're going to make a small change in t and then see what happens to x and y. Okay? And so what you can see, it's a little hard to see the green line, which is right here, is that the predator and the prey are going to have a cyclical behavior. That is, as the number of prey increases, then the predators are going to increase because they start eating the prey, and then the prey are going to decline as they're getting eaten. But then as the prey disappear, the predators are at a high value, and then they start to decline because they don't have anything to eat, and then the whole process starts over again. Okay? Now, this is a very simple system. It kind of makes sense that you would have this cyclical behavior. And we use it as a way of describing some of the initial steps that we're going to take for modeling a system where we have differential equations rather than differential equations. We're going to use that as our starting point. Now, just to introduce it to you, because you may see it in your readings and as you go further, there's a way in which when we have two equations, both of which are functions of t, we can divide those two differential equations and convert dx dt and dy dt into dy dx. All right? So what you can see is that that's just dividing these two equations by each other, and then you get one equation that shows how much y depends on x. All right? Now, of course, that also has an analytical solution, which is shown there. Okay, now, when we have our equation of this form, then we can directly imagine that we can plot y as a function of x, right? So we have an analytical expression for y as a function of x, so we can just plot y versus x and forget about t. Okay? That's the idea behind the implicit form, so we just plot the two dependent variables versus each other. When we plot dependent variables versus each other, we call that kind of a plot a phase plane or a phase portrait that enables us to describe, again, sort of the origin of the idea of phases that in chemical reactions or in physical reactions you sometimes have, or in physics transitions, you have transitions between different behaviors, different phases, as in phases of matter, and that's where this terminology comes from. And so those phase planes are a good way for us to describe or to represent a system when we only have two variables, okay? Two dependent variables. So here's a phase plane for this system. Here's our x and y variables, and each of the yellow curves is a different starting value of the number of predator and prey. So if we start with x equals 1 and y equals 0.6 approximately here, then this is how the system is going to behave. Okay? If we start with x equals 1 and y is lower than that, then we're going to get this. And so what that's telling us is that we have, for this series of equations, defines a set of behaviors, a set of loops, where the loop occurs depends on the initial concentration of the two species. Right? But that there's always going to be this reciprocal relationship between them, such that as one increases, the other is decreasing, so that we get a cyclical behavior. Now, it also illustrates that we're showing, superimposed on this, the direction in which the derivative is pointing. Okay? So if we go back here, so here was our differential equation for y as a function of x. We can evaluate this and say, what is the amount of y change as a function of the x change, and show that on our plot here. Okay? So what this is saying is, as I go from this value of x to this value of x, then y wants to go up. Okay? As I go towards the right, y wants to go up. It's strong in this case here, and it doesn't change very much in this case here. So depending on where the arrow is pointing, it shows us the magnitude of the derivative at that combination of values of x and y. Right? So at x and y here, we have a strong derivative, so the arrow is pointing up. At this point, we have a low derivative of y, but a big derivative of x, and so it's pointing sideways. All right? So the point is, this gives us a very good way of summarizing the behavior of the system when we only have two variables. And one of the drawbacks is it doesn't have an explicit way for us to see time, but we can sort of imagine time on here, because we can see that there's this cyclical behavior. So we don't know exactly what time it's happening, but we see that there's a cycle going on. Okay, and we can also, given a phase plane like this, we can realize that we can tell exactly what's going to happen for any other value of x and y, any other initial value of x and y, such as if we started here, we know that the derivatives are pointing that way. We can just sort of follow the arrows in order to construct our curve that describes what the rates of change are. Okay? Now, for describing the system, we talked about before, one of the things that we want to be able to do is to describe any possible steady states that the system has. And so, in that case, we can set the derivatives to 0, right? So we had dy dx was this expression here, or dy dt, and dy dx was this. So we can set the derivatives themselves to 0, which is the same as saying that the value of that variable is not changing. And we set them to 0 and solve for the value of x. And the value of x is the solution, the steady state would be m over b, and y over and r over a, and the other steady states are y equals 0. Okay? X and y equals 0, which you can see from here. All right? So whenever y is 0, the rate of change of y is 0. Whenever x is 0, the rate of y is change of x is 0. But then you also have the steady states that are shown. Now, what that means is that there is a steady state value, but the system can't get there. So this was an example, I'm sorry, right here, right? There are steady state values here, there are steady state values here, but the system can't get to them because the derivatives are pointing away from where they are. Okay? So the steady state value would be right in here, right? Because all of the variables, all of these 4 variables are 1, so the steady state would be x equals 1 and y equals 1. But if we look at the graph, that's where the steady state would be, but we can't get there because the derivatives are pointing away from that point, trying to make it go around. Now, the only way we could get there, if we started at x equals 1 and y equals 1, we would just stay there. In every other case, with the derivatives are pointing to make this circle, and that's the way the system would evolve. Okay, so how do we build this model? So far, we've just kind of looked at the model itself and what the results are. How would we build a model of this using MATLAB, for example? This file is on Blackboard. The basic idea is that this is just going to follow exactly what it is, what's written in the text. And the idea is that we're going to use a function to do the modeling, but I'm putting this in here just for right now for you to have in case you want to explore it on your own. If you have used MATLAB or any kind of programming languages before and you want to do this on your own, I'm putting it in here, but we're going to actually go through the details of that on Friday. Okay? So the code there generates plots like the ones we looked at that were taken out of the textbook, and also generates phase planes like we saw in the example from the textbook. Okay? So this is just reproducing the same graphs that were in there. Okay. So to summarize what we've done then so far there, we introduced the idea that we can have a system that's described by differential equations where we're measuring, where we see the change in variables in our system is continuous with changes in the other variables in our system. And we looked at a system where we had rates of change of 2 variables, 2 dependent variables, and 1 independent variable, so they were all relating to each other. In order to build a model of such a system that's defined by differential equations, we can go over what are the things that we need in order to do that. The things we need are the differential equations themselves, some set of functions that describes how the system changes. We need the parameter values that are in those functions, whatever the functions are, they have some parameters. We need to have those parameter values themselves. And we need the boundary or initial conditions. Where should we start? So that's going to be in the form typically of saying that when x is 0, we know that y is 7. Okay, so it's going to be values of all of the variables at some particular value of the independent variable. All right? So once we have that, that's the minimum that we require. So whenever we're looking at modeling a system of differential equations, we know there has to be a way for us to get those things or we can't get anywhere. So we have the differentials, the parameters, and the boundary conditions. But then in addition, we have to choose an integration method, whether it's a simple one like Euler's method or whether it's a more complicated one like one of the Runge-Kutta methods. And we have to choose a step size. And we have this trade-off between having smaller step sizes requires us to take more steps in order to get to a particular desired point that we need to get to. If we're trying to model, for example, the behavior of a system over a year, and we have a differential equation, so we want to know what's going to happen after a year. We could integrate every month, or we can integrate every day, or we can integrate every second, but we still have to get to that same value. And that kind of notion, what that means is, if we're integrating every day, then it's going to take us 365 steps. If we're integrating every second, it's going to take us a heck of a lot more. All right? But then we're trading off that integration interval for accuracy. And then, analogously to the way we had a parameter line, where we could take the value of a parameter and describe the behavior of the system for different values of that, we have this idea of a phase portrait or a phase plane, where now we have two variables that we plot versus each other, and then we can describe the behavior of the system. Now, I shouldn't have said analogously to a parameter line, because I made a very important mistake there. The phase plane is not describing the parameters, it's describing the experimental variables. When we only had one experimental variable versus time, like we had for the insects, we could just make a plot of that variable versus time, just a direct kinetic plot. But when we have a system of more than one variable, and when we can plot those variables versus each other in what's called a phase plane, we're going to talk about a parameter plane later, which describes the behavior of the system as a function of parameters. But in this case, phase portrait, phase plane, very important. It's describing the behavior of two of the dependent variables versus each other. And of course, if you have a system that only has two dependent variables, that's very good, because you can plot both of them directly. If you have a system that has more than two, then you have to sort of hide some of them, and we're going to see some examples of that later. All right, and we'll stop there.